Okay, does this look okay?
It looks perfect.
Okay, I'm just gonna keep this up then.
Great.
Okay.
The live stream is booting, and so we are now live.
Okay, does this look okay?
It looks perfect.
Okay, I think this is working. Hello, everyone. On behalf of my colleagues at the Society of Fellows and the Heyman Center for the Humanities and the Institute for Religion, Culture, and Public Life, I want to thank you, everyone, for joining us in this fourth panel of our series titled Apocalypse Pending, Religion, Politics, and Social Media. I'm Camille Ropsis. I teach in the departments of French and History here at Columbia, and I've been a Heyman Fellow for the past academic year. Over the past few months, Apocalypse Pending has explored the alarming spread of conspiracy thinking in our current moment and its historical and contemporary effects on evangelical religious movements in the United States. It has considered how new media technologies have made it possible for the dissemination of conspiracy thinking on a scale that was unimaginable in the past, how the moral panic it generates is impacting social and political life worldwide, and whether there are measures to control its spread or mitigate its effects. The first two panels took place shortly after the 2020 US presidential election and focused on QAnon and social media in the first instance, and in the second instance on how QAnon beliefs were creating a schism within the evangelical community. The third panel, in the wake of the violent attacks on the US Capitol of January 6, considered how the numbers of QAnon followers have burgeoned during the pandemic, finding new members among the New Agers and anti-vaxxers, You can see all those on our website, recordings of it if you're interested. Today, I'm really happy to be introducing our two speakers, Michael Butter and Marc-André Argentino, who will discuss the spread of QAnon in Europe and elsewhere in the world, how it has morphed from being a Trump-centered phenomenon to a magnet for anti-government conspiracy thinkers of all stripes. So I'm going to introduce the panelists briefly, and then I will give them the floor, and then we will have a Q&A session. We have some time for this after that, so if you have any questions, please write them in the Q&A box, and I will read them out, probably grouped at the end for our speakers. So Michael Butter is a professor of American Literary and Cultural History at the University of Tübingen since 2014. He received his PhD from the University of Bonn in 2007 and his habilitation from the University of Freiburg in 2012. He is the author of 4 monographs, and I'm only going to mention the English title so you don't have to hear my horrible German pronunciation. The Epitome of Evil, Hitler in American Fiction, 1939 to 2002. Plots, Design, and Schemes, American Conspiracy Theories from the Puritans to the Present. And the last book, The Nature of Conspiracy Theories, that was published in 2020. His research interests include the colonial period and the early republic, the construction of heroes and their cultural functions, the poetics of contemporary TV shows, conspiracy theories, and populism. From 2016 to 2020, he was the vice chair of the Coast Action Comparative Analysis of Conspiracy Theories. And since 2020, he's been one of the principal investigators in an ERC-funded project on populism and conspiracy theory. Marc-André Argentino is a research fellow at the ICSR and a PhD candidate in the Individualized Program at Concordia University. His research examines how extremist groups leverage technology to create propaganda, recruit members to ideological causes, inspire acts of violence, and impact democratic institutions. He holds an MA from the Université Laval and a BA from Concordia. Marc-André is also an associate fellow at the Global Network on Extremism and Technology and an associate researcher at the Centre d'Expertise et de Formation sur les intégrismes religieux, les idéologies politiques, and la radicalisation. So I'm really thrilled that they could both join us today, and I will hand over the floor to them, and I'm really looking forward to their presentations. Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Camille, and for this kind introduction. I'm very happy to be here, even though I have to say the only country I will be addressing in any detail tonight, at least in this short statement, is Germany, and then Marc-André can step in and provide the larger picture. First of all, and that goes for Germany, but for many other countries as well, so I'm already breaking this rule, we have to say we're not living in an age of conspiracy theories, even though it sometimes feels like that. So historians of conspiracy theory are by now fairly sure that they were far more popular in the past, and they were just not considered a problem back then until the middle of the 20th century, and therefore they were not discussed as conspiracy theories. So put pointedly, until 60 or 70 years ago, people worried about conspiracies. And of course, these people are still around today, but there's an increasing number of people around now that worries about conspiracy theories. And this panel, or this series of panels, is evidence of that. Scholars are also divided about the question which impact the internet has made on conspiracy theories. There are some that argue that it has vastly increased their popularity. There are some that argue that it has had very little effect. Joe Oshinsky, the American political scientist, would be an example of that. And there are some who say that it has had maybe a moderate effect. Of course, this is all very difficult to measure in quantitative terms because we just don't have any polls from before the advent of the internet, except maybe a couple of Gallup polls about the moon landing and the Kennedy assassination. My perspective on that is that the internet has probably led to a moderate increase in the belief in conspiracy theories because it has greatly increased their visibility and availability. And therefore, probably 30 years ago, fewer Germans believed in conspiracy theories than there are now. For the past 6 or 7 years, there have been regular quantitative studies, polls of how many Germans display what psychologists call a conspiracy mentality, that is a general tendency to believe in conspiracy theories. Well, one can argue about how useful that is, but it has been established as a term. So here is the number. About 1/3 of the German population has some propensity towards conspiracy thinking, which does not believe that 1/3 of the German population really organizes their lives around conspiracy theories. It's rather 1/3 of that third, so 10 to 12, 14, 15% that really consider belief in conspiracy theories crucial to their identities. And the interesting thing is that this number has not gone up during the corona pandemic. When the pandemic began last spring, there was a lot of talk immediately about how the pandemic was accompanied by an infodemic and how conspiracy beliefs were exponentially increasing in Germany. In the fall and winter, a couple of quantitative studies came out that had interviewed people, collected their data long after the beginning of the pandemic, and they all come to the result that it's still about 1/3 that believes in conspiracy theories, and some even suggest that the numbers may have gone down slightly, and that may have to do with the fact that tolerance for conspiracy theories has decreased over the past months because they are really considered a problem. I got an email this afternoon inviting me to the presentation of a study on corona conspiracy theories in Germany, and one number that they included there is that about 15% of the German population believe in coronavirus conspiracy theories, and that sounds about right. There was a study done by the University of Mainz in 2017 that asked for belief in individual conspiracy theories, and with the more popular ones, it's usually between 10 and 20%. So 17% of Germans back then believed that 9/11 was an inside job, 16% believed the moon landing had been staged in a TV studio, and so on and so on. I think the top answer was Lady Di was killed by the British Secret Service. That was more than 30% back then. The interesting thing now, of course, is that even though the absolute numbers appear not to have gone up, it feels very different. And many people tell me, and I do a lot of public outreach, that there is a family member, a friend, a colleague who now articulates conspiracy theories. And that is true for my larger family as well. Now, what has happened is probably that these people had a tendency towards conspiracy theories before, but kept this to themselves. And the COVID crisis has made them more outspoken because it has emotionalized and mobilized them. And I think that has to do with the threat scenario that is different now. Very often conspiracy theories are a fairly abstract thing, especially if they don't revolve around medical questions. So if you think you've understood who really conducted the 9/11 attacks, this doesn't really affect the next day of your life. You can still get up, go to work, pick up your kids, go for a run, and so on and so on. But if you believe in a conspiracy theory about COVID, then of course you're constantly reminded during your waking hours that this conspiracy is going on because the conspiracy now seems to be targeting you. And I think this has made people who already had a tendency to believe in conspiracy theories more extreme in their convictions and thus more outspoken. And one part of that outspokenness has been an embracement of some parts of the German conspiracy theory community of QAnon conspiracy theories. They arrived in Germany years ago. So there are some people that I observe online who already early in 2018 spread QAnon content, but that was a fairly minor thing. And during the demonstrations that have been taking place for the past couple of months against the corona measures of the government in various German cities, there have always been QAnon flags and signs, and this has greatly upset many people because of the anti-Semitic content of these conspiracy theories and the sheer insanity of some of the claims of this particular conspiracy theory. And I'm curious about the numbers that Marc-André can provide us with, because the latest number I saw is a study by, or an estimation by the Amadeo Antonio Foundation, which is a German foundation that counters right-wing extremism, and that estimated that about 185,000 Germans now believe in QAnon conspiracy theories. That's, of course, a fairly big number, and it's definitely 10 times, probably more bigger than it was about 2 years ago. However, there's about 80 million Germans, and 3% of them, the 2017 study from the University of Mainz shows us, believe that reptiles in human form rule the earth. So compared to that, QAnon conspiracy theories are still a relatively minor thing in Germany. It seems to me that may have changed in the past couple of months, but this at least is my impression. So once again, I think here we need to be careful not to confuse visibility with actual popularity, because of course, many QAnon believers actively search the limelight. They search the cameras. They want to appear bigger than they are, and very often they succeed. The German weekly Der Spiegel, the most important political weekly in Germany, had a cover last fall that said that QAnon was the most dangerous cult in the world. And while I'm far from taking QAnon not seriously, because we all know that conspiracy theories can have problematic and dangerous effects, and QAnon would be a particularly worrying one, I think that is slightly exaggerated, and brings me to my final point, and that is that at least in Germany, and as an Americanist, I would say it's very different in the US, where this worry is far more justified. In Germany, sometimes there seems to be something like conspiracy theory panic that mirrors the conspiracy panic of the conspiracy theorists, where conspiracy theories are made bigger and more dangerous than they actually are. They are not at all unproblematic, but they are not the biggest challenge that German democracy is facing at the moment. And the QAnon conspiracy theory still seems to be a fairly minor thing. But then, as Camille said when she introduced me, I am currently principal investigator of a project that looks at different European countries. And we haven't really looked at QAnon conspiracy theories, but when it comes to other conspiracy theories there and their connection to populism, Germany still seems to be a place that is fairly well off compared to Italy or to Poland or to Hungary or Brazil, which is also a country that we're looking at, where conspiracy theories are far more popular and far more influential because they're also embraced by public figures, which is something that, unlike in the US as well, is not really happening in Germany until now. Conspiracy theories are still very stigmatized, and those who articulate them usually are out of office very quickly. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much, Michael. Marc-André, go ahead.
Since I have data, I will be sharing some visual representations. All right. So I'm going to be exploring a little bit more into the wider dimension of the transnational QAnon community. Basically, I'm going to go right in. I've found QAnon communities within 85 countries over the past 3 years. It's not only transnational in its followership, but its narratives have been able to adapt to the sociopolitical context of where these locals are. To determine whether QAnon is located in a country, it's not about where an individual account is believed to be, but rather I look at these communities based on how they are adapting the QAnon core narratives to their local context. Are they looking at Q drops and adapting it to news that's happening in their countries? Are they looking at how their own political context, their own strife, their own social dynamics function within the QAnon narrative? Are they, a lot of them now are talking at, there are multiple deep states around the world, and the US was the first country to awaken. It's now turned for, other citizens of other countries to awaken themselves to how their government is corrupt and being run by these deep state elites. So it's really about how they're adapting to this. When it comes to the size, I did put very high concentration to very low concentration, but like Michael said, it's very difficult to measure these because social media data is skewed, and it's very difficult to attribute the existence of a specific individual to a region. I could sit at home and create a QAnon page and pretend that I'm based in India, and I could start typing in Urdu and sharing local news. And it's very difficult to measure that just by looking at the data at its end. Until there's proper mixed method polling of both online, offline individuals in a way that you're not going to want to have QAnon believers to hide their belief systems, it's going to be very difficult to get some numbers. But using some data, used specifically for Facebook, I could get an idea of how these communities have grown over time. And I've broken down the data into 2 categories, whether it was groups that I evaluated to be based in the United States and international groups. And I broke down the data further between data that existed between November 2017, when QAnon first started, to January 2020. And January 2020 up until August 2020, where I did my collection for this specific crop, to see how much data had changed over time. And what was happening was that the international pages and international groups saw that 62% of their membership happened, or members joined these groups as of January 2020. And really it was during the pandemic where most of these groups grew. Michael was right though. I saw content for German QAnon back in 2018, same thing in France and the UK and Italy. There were small clusters prior to that, but the pandemic really led to a growth in membership. Whereas if you're looking at, let's say, QAnon groups, most of their growth happened before the pandemic. They've had socio-political circumstances within the United States that led to their growth prior to that. Pages grew a bit more, mainly because influencers were turning that into a means of publicity, which is why most of their growth happened after 2020. But ultimately, 3 in 10 new QAnon members, this will probably be better like this. There you go. 3 in 10 new QAnon members as of this year basically were international. So a third of new membership really came from the international community. And as of August 2020, 48% of all QAnon accounts on Facebook were in international pages or group. And this was before the big takedown by Facebook. This doesn't only apply to Facebook data. If we're looking at the most recent data, this was provided to me by a colleague of mine, Jordan Wilson at the Logically, and he's been doing some research on QAnon German Telegram. The German Telegram was probably one of the more sophisticated digital ecosystem prior to the mass takedown of QAnon accounts that happened after the January 6th insurrection. But what we saw is that in the data is that the average post per day in the German context that chats related to QAnon saw a decrease after Biden became president. This is where a period where, kind of the myth of QAnon saw an initial collapse where the prediction didn't come true. Trump was not reelected. There was the whole fallout and the attention from January 6th. And people were kind of wary as to what's going to happen next. But as the pandemic went on, more measures were put into place. Additional waves were going on. We saw a pickup again in how these actors have been posting. And it's also they've adapted their narratives away from specifically QAnon tropes, but adapting it to the COVID pandemic. And this is what's really keeping these individuals alive. It's important to note that prior to the pandemic, QAnon was really much on a downturn. After the Christchurch incident, 8chan was taken down. It took 3 months before 8kun came back. There was no messages from Q. The influencers weren't able to really build up the same type of momentum. And even when 8kun came back up, it wasn't the same type of followership up until the pandemic provided a way for them to peddle a new set of disinformation and create enough chaos that it wasn't only attractive to domestic markets, but it really went outside of the US. And this is where we're getting into a very interesting space. Before, it was very easy to track QAnon in a way. Facebook was a great tool. Twitter was a great tool. It was easy to track them. It was also easy for them to spread their content. But now that they've been deplatformed, they're really moving to all of these alt tech platforms, which not only means different places for them to go, but it also means that different countries and different platforms unique to other countries are available to these actors. And when QAnon followers moved from Parler to Telegram, let's say, there was already a very sophisticated international community. The Italian, Brazilian, French, and the German communities on Telegram were very large and very established. When these influencers from Twitter came on, they gained a huge amount of followers from the international community, as well as their communities on Telegram that already existed. So you're really seeing how the dynamics and the mixing between these communities has really happened. And you're seeing now this type of shift where there's a lot more interest in what's happening around the world within the QAnon community. It's not as closed. What this has led to, though, is an exporting of the type of mobilization that has occurred. And this is where one of the importance, I think, that we need to demystify, the one important thing to talk about is it's not necessarily about belief in QAnon, but it's how QAnon mobilizes individuals. And I think that's the distinction between, other conspiracy theories in the past and QAnon. Technology has really given the capacity for conspiracy theorists to build communities and find other people like them around the world and share these stories and provide more quote unquote evidence to their belief system. But it also helps them, trade tradecraft, organize in different ways. We've seen the French and the Germans kind of use a similar tactic to break down into different districts to share specific content that is very localized, as the French had done during the Gilets jaunes protests. So as the ecosystems evolve, you're not only exporting it to other countries, but other countries are provided to different platforms, making it very difficult to track the content, but also making it quite available to a bunch of other actors. And just kind of to close a bit, here's what the transnational mobilization for QAnon could look like. If we take France, for example, QAnon first arrived in France via the Gilets jaunes disinformation ecosystem in 2018. The disinformation, the conspiracy theories, all the type of landscape really brought the first entryway into France. And it was really via some actors in Canada, sadly, were in Quebec, that were translating English content into French, and it was being sent abroad to France and Belgium and Switzerland. What we've seen is, as this has evolved in November 2020, a now defunct Telegram channel that was called Le Grand Réveil Radical had a specific group of individuals that were planning militia training in the south of France. And this was ex-military individuals, ex-police officers that were offering their services for patriots to train and prepare themselves to defeat the deep state in France, which is obviously the Macron government. This type of data is also not only recorded anecdotally in the type of social media data that I've been looking at, but also Mivilud, the government institute, has received at least 10 testimonies, which shows the influence and indoctrination of relatives into the QAnon ideology. So you're also seeing individuals who are concerned enough about this that they want to inform the government that they're concerned about their families being radicalized into this movement. And just this weekend, as I was preparing for this presentation, there was a mother who was part of the prepper community. Her Facebook page was filled with lovely QAnon content. She solicited 4 men to kidnap her 8-year-old daughter. And these men were also planning to kidnap other children and to bomb vaccine clinics. And what you're seeing is, as QAnon moves outside of the United States and blends with other sociopolitical environments, you're seeing them blend with other movements and ideologies. And in the French context, the French prepper community and the French conspiracy community have blended together in an alarming way. And this is kind of a trend that should be observed. Is it going to happen exponentially? Probably not, but there is enough there to raise a few red flags that this should be something that is observed. Similarly, we've seen something in the UK. The yellow vest ecosystem, like Les Gilets jaunes, is where this initially came in and gained some popularity. In the UK, this was really more about how QAnon was able to mobilize British citizens. It was really about freedom for children, or the Save the Children campaign, which again initiated with a Canadian QAnon influencer, went viral around the world with Wayfair. And the Save the Children campaign kind of went all over. And it was this group of individuals that were mobilizing against child trafficking. The fact that a conspiracy theory could mobilize people is what raises concern, because it is impacting them behaviorally in a way that you won't necessarily see with other conspiracy theories. And again, as it evolves over time, in the UK, there was freedom rallies that were being held. And one example in Trafalgar Square, where you saw QAnon fraternizing with members of the defunct British Union of Fascists. Is you're seeing the evolution from conspiracy theorists to ideologically motivated violent extremists. This is where it gets a little more concerning. In Canada, for example, it's also been different instances. Now, one of the first instances of violence was actually not towards individuals, but towards infrastructure, where conspiracy theorists in Quebec who believed, COVID was caused by 5G and QAnon and other conspiracy theories burnt down 4G towers, because obviously they weren't able to tell the difference between 4G and 5G, but you saw them actually attack critical infrastructure. This is not the only case. We've seen conspiracy theorists, whether they're flat earthers or believe in reptilian conspiracy theories, attack vaccination centers or other critical infrastructures. And there is a detrimental impact, especially during a pandemic, that needs to be considered. In March of 2020, a Canadian Armed Forces reservist who posted about QAnon and Event 201 rammed his truck through the gates of the Prime Minister's residence. Again, QAnon or conspiracy theories were kind of the ideological framework that this person inhabited, but the grievances that were attributed to the pandemic that impacted his life, that forced his business to shut down, the anger that the conspiracy theories directed toward the government is what led this person to act. And again, we've seen similar places where QAnon adherents in at least Quebec were arrested for making threats against journalists, intimidating and making threats against law enforcement officers. This type of mobilization behaviors is the tip of the iceberg that could lead to more dangerous actions. And though Michael already corrected Germany, I want to add a couple of things. Conspiracy theories do have an impact that can be in extreme cases quite dangerous. And Hanau is an example where an individual's racist beliefs, extremist beliefs, combined with, obscure conspiracy theories which echoed QAnon but were not linked to QAnon, led this individual to shoot up a shisha bar. You saw adherents that are linking more and more with the Reichsbürger movement have aligned themselves also with the AfD. As you're seeing them not only go towards the populist movement, but more towards the extreme spectrum of the political parties, that does raise more concerns for the type of mobilization and behavior. And though everyone thinks of January 6th, the insurrection on January 6th, as the first type of critical incident, I'm always brought back to what happened in Berlin in Germany, where actors that were more from the ideological motivated violent extremism space, along with some QAnon members, actually tried to breach the Reichstag. And you're seeing individuals mobilize and trying to attack critical government infrastructures. And I think this is where the concern is. It's not necessarily about how many people believe in this, but it's how QAnon and its anti-government concern about the vaccines is mobilizing people to behavior. And I think that's what needs to be focused on rather than some other topics. And I'm going to end there since that's right on the dot.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Marc-André. I see that there's a Q&A starting to bloom. So please, audience, ask your questions there and I will read them. I wanted to start the conversation with 3 questions that I had. And then I'll read some of the questions that are coming in, perhaps bunch them together. Thank you, first of all, to both for these really fascinating presentations. I think one of the questions that I have, I'm sure there's not an easy answer to this, but I wonder if you could reflect on the kind of the relationship between more historical understandings of these conspiracy theories and more psychological understandings. Because, for example, Michael, you started your presentation saying that conspiracy theories have always existed, but then the question I think then is why do they bloom up when they bloom up, right? And should we think of this as a kind of feature of human psychology, or in a kind of more structural ahistorical way, or how much of this is a kind of product of particular circumstances, right? At the same time, you both stress the kind of impact of COVID and things like that. So that's one question. Linked to this, I was also wondering if with your data, I think Marc-André, especially your map was really interesting. Do you see a correlation between first of all, the level of religiosity in the country, right? Whether countries that have a more kind of religious public sphere are more prone to these conspiracy theories, and then within those, it would seem like the answer would be no, because some countries that are more secular seem to be also just as prone. But then, do you see a difference also between more evangelical countries and more Catholic countries in the data that you found? And finally, I wanted to know also if you had any thoughts about the kind of the European legislation on these conspiracy groups, which we know that, at least I know about France. I know less about the rest of the world, but France has a much more strict regulation of free speech, right? Or hate speech rather. So could you say a little bit more about whether that has any impact also on the data you've assembled? If you had any thoughts on this, that would be great. And then I'll read some of the questions from the audience.
Okay, maybe I can start with the psychology versus history question. The jury is still out on whether conspiracy theories are an anthropological given, if they really exist everywhere at all times. So many scholars these days would argue that they, at least in their modern form, emerged during the early modern period, when there is media technology to spread them, when there is a reading public, when there is maybe also a certain notion of the human subject as being able to act in a very specific way. But what is quite clear is, of course, that conspiracy theories have always answered to certain psychological needs. So I don't think that we're hardwired through evolution to believe in conspiracy theories. I just think that conspiracy theories are a specific way to answer to certain or to do certain things that we're really hardwired to do. So I think there is a certain tendency in human beings to link cause and effect, to recognize causality. There is also a certain tendency to recognize patterns because that was important for the survival of the species at some point. And of course, at some point, then conspiracy theories become a way of doing this. So conspiracy theories, therefore, of course, highlight human agency. They reduce contingency and chaos. They create a world that is completely meaningful because nothing happens by accident. They also allow you to identify enemies, people that you can point your fingers at, scapegoats. Of course, we have scapegoats outside of conspiracy narratives as well, but within conspiracy theories, they're specific scapegoats because they're operating in secret. And if you have scapegoats, then of course that means you don't have to ask yourself if you're responsible for anything, because it's those evil guys that are responsible. And it also, to a certain degree, and that might be a paradox at first sight, it means that conspiracy theories have a certain optimistic note. They seem to be utterly pessimistic, dark forces pulling the strings. But of course, it's human actors. And if it's human actors, then they can be exposed. And at least in theory, they can also be defeated. Whereas if you're dealing with contingency or if you're dealing with structural factors, it's far more difficult to change things. So a prominent German conspiracy theorist, Ken Jebsen, said during the early months of the pandemic in a video, I think that was clicked 3 million times on YouTube, you just have to stop Bill Gates and it's all over. If it was that easy to stop a global pandemic. But there you see the optimism that informs conspiracy theories. Now, it's sometimes said that conspiracy theories are very much linked to crises. And I think that's partly true. I think that they're more linked to uncertainty, at least in the past decades, because they are an answer to uncertainty, because they provide a very clear narrative. They identify who is responsible and what this is all about. So I think they are crisis phenomena only insofar as crises usually are moments of uncertainty. And I think an example to ponder in that regard are the 9/11 attacks. Of course, there are conspiracy theories immediately after the 9/11 attacks, but they only become really prominent and popular a couple of years later when there is a certain uncertainty about the role of the United States in the world with the Iraq war and all of that. This is when the 9/11 truth movement really takes off, not immediately after the attacks, because there, and I'm of course generalizing extremely here, the American people are fairly sure who they are and who the bad guys are. And then 3 years later, that is not so clear anymore because their own government suddenly seems very, very suspicious. So I'm not so sure that conspiracy theories really blossom in times of crises. It might be that there's also a certain historical misperception at work there, because this is what historians usually focus on. We look at moments of crisis, moments of transformation, and we might miss out on other moments where they are just as popular, but largely flying under the radar. And now I let Marc-André take the secularization question, which is also quite tough one.
Though just to add on what you said, Michael, I do agree that like crisis is not necessarily what creates conspiracy theories, because there's a constant existence of conspiracy theories. They evolve, they morph. I think the pandemic is unique in the sense that it affected the entire world all at once, and the entire world almost shut down all at once. And it created this type of global community around this one event. So it did bring individuals and grievances together that might not have necessarily blended. But I think it is important to highlight that beyond just the monumental event that the pandemic was, there is constance in where these actors exist. And it's just, like individuals in positions of power, whether they were elected officials, movie stars, celebrities, thinkers, whatever you want, were participating or sharing or trying to answer what was happening to them. And QAnon was one of the answers. Honestly, I think if we would do some polling and we'd look at growth in religious belief and institutions during the pandemic, we might see some growth in people attending religious services or turning to religion to try to explain what the hell is going on. Because ultimately, people are going to QAnon because they want to know, why is there a pandemic? Why did I lose my job? Why did my wife get sick? Why is all of this happening, right? And QAnon provides that answer. Whether you want to think it's crazy or it's not, some people find comfort in that, and that's where it gets to. And I think that's something that we need to keep in mind. When it comes to the secularization question, man, that's not an easy one. I think you kind of said it a bit, Kemi, but in reality, we've seen QAnon bloom in places like France and Quebec, and those are very secular societies. it really shows that QAnon can adapt to different type of environments, and it doesn't necessarily have to be religious. Yes, it started in the US. Christianity, evangelicalism play an important role not only in society and in politics in that context, so it is imbued with it, especially as the figure of Q did share content related to spiritual warfare and Christianity. I guess there is some affinity because of that to evangelicals and Catholics. I have even written an article about the Church of QAnon and how there's specific, charismatics that were linking religion and conspiracy theories. But over time, I've heard stories from individuals in the Catholic Church or other pastors from the more mainstream evangelical communities sharing this type of content. And it's not necessarily QAnon specific, but it's really more about the disinformation and conspiracy theories. And it's, again, how the answers they're trying to provide their congregants or they're trying to consume matches with their worldviews. So it's not necessarily whether secularity or religious belief will act as a factor that will make it easier to believe in conspiracy theories or will act as a protective factor. I think it really comes down to the individual who's trying to seek an answer if that's what they're going to try to get comfort in. Because you could see on the flip side, religious leaders standing up against QAnon saying this is getting into our communities, this is problematic, we don't want to deal with it. And on the flip sides, early on, we saw pastors that were just saying, we're going to keep the church open. This is from the deep state. They want to shut down religion and control us. You're seeing both sides of the spectrum. Is it going to be more susceptible in religion? I think it might be that way. Again, as Michael says, that might be what's making the media a bit more. Because if you have a mega church or a pastor or someone that's really out there showing that type of belief, it's what will catch a headline rather than those who are saying, no, we're not going to stand for this. We're going to fight against it. So I think the way that it's represented in popular culture and in media impacts the way that the average individual or even researchers will perceive the threat of QAnon or conspiracy theories.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So we have a bunch of questions. So I'm going to maybe group them into 4, and then that way we can have 3 rounds or so of questions. So, I know you probably won't be able to answer everything, but pick whatever you'd like out of them. So from Jennifer Harris, is there a correlation between the success of countries in dealing with COVID and the presence or absence of QAnon membership? For example, New Zealand has done really well versus the US, which has done less well. So maybe we can go back to your map on this, Marc-André. From Sam Kestenbaum, QAnon is often referred to as far right. Is that correct, or is that a simplification? From Zahid Chaudhry, a question more specific to Michael Butter. Michael Butter argued that conspiracy theory is not as alarming a problem in Germany as it might seem. However, there does seem to be a new form of political allyship across different paranoid publics, anti-vaxxers, QAnon, anti-Semites, wellness industry, etc. Quantitative data that Michael cited cannot capture that reality. Could Michael speak on the kind of diagonal alliances across these otherwise disparate groups? Do such coalitional politics pose a threat to liberal democracy? And I'm going to take one more if that's okay with you guys. I hope you can keep it all in. How do you distinguish between QAnon followers, those that directly self-identify with Q, either by direct referencing or through various Q, the t-shirts, the teacups, etc., and people who are following or adhering to anti-government, anti-vax logics outside of a direct Q reference? So let's take these maybe, and then we'll do another round if that's okay. Whoever wants to go first. Yeah, go ahead.
I'll start with the shortest answer that I could do is we'll start with the Sam's question, which is QAnon is referred to as far right. Honestly, that's an oversimplification, mainly because at least in academia, far right is a very contentious term when it comes to defining and how to use it. And even when you think of the think tank or government community and how you want to define this term, it's not appropriate use. I personally have borrowed language that's used by the Canadian government, which is ideologically motivated violent extremism, because groups like QAnon or incels or some of the newer anti-establishment movements are not necessarily where you'd fit in traditional right-wing extremist movements. They're not necessarily where you'd fit in traditional politically motivated extremist movements or religiously motivated extremist movements. They're really a new type of breed, and fitting it into this new definition provides the type of flexibility to look at something like QAnon, because if you go to some like the group I call Pastel QAnon, so the women who are in this esoteric yoga alternative health type environment cannot and should not be treated the same as the anti-establishment insurrectionist QAnon individual, or the individual in QAnon who drove a truck on the Hoover Dam and held it hostage with explosives and a rifle, right? There's an entire spectrum. So putting it within something like that permits that, I think, is an easier way to do it. If it's to answer your popular culture general reference to far right, as it would be used in the media, the answer is yes. But as an academic, the answer is no, because that's a little bit too much of a simplification. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, if that was your short answer, I can be slightly more extensive now. I can take the first question, at least with regard to Germany. So, and Marc-André, step in at any point. My impression is that there's not necessarily a connection between how successful countries are at fighting the pandemic and the popularity of conspiracy theories, but I suspect that there is one between the different form that these conspiracy theories about the pandemic take. So, for example, you could argue that Germany, either because of skill or sheer luck, was fairly successful at fighting the pandemic during the first wave last spring, and this seems to have motivated German conspiracy theories about corona to take a very specific turn, because there is hardly any talk in Germany, or there was hardly any after February 2020, that this is a biological weapon that was intentionally or accidentally released. Instead, the conspiracy theories that dominate in Germany all have in common that they claim that the virus either does not exist at all or is completely harmless. And this hasn't really changed, because these narratives formed last spring and haven't really changed since then. And I would suspect that in countries that were hit much harder, conspiracy theories might just take a different shape about the corona pandemic. Would you agree, Marc-André?
No, I would agree. And I think it's kind of reflective in how conspiracy theories are adapted to their environments. Like you said, like Australia and New Zealand, very successful in dealing with the pandemic. They're also lucky to be in their own small islands and keeping their own ecosystems closed. However, that hasn't stopped the spread of conspiracy theories or the growth of them, or whatever you want to call it. But what has happened is how they're talking about conspiracy, how they're shifting. And you can even look where countries where have been less successful with the pandemic. You know, right now where I am in Quebec, it's really still about anti-lockdown measures, anti-mask wearing measures. In places where they're really rolling out the vaccines, it's about the harm caused by the vaccines and the role that is, or population control. You still have places that are more tied on, you know, the origin with Bill Gates or George Soros or whatever you want. So it's really how it's adaptive. And ultimately, we get rid of COVID, the pandemic goes away. The core necessity for some of these individuals to need to believe in a conspiracy theory or to use conspiracy theories to explain things is not necessarily going to go away, whether that's part of the human nature that Michael talked about. It could also be a cultural phenomenon. And I don't think there's enough information out there for us to give a concrete answer on that.
I mean, this is in a way also reflected by the specific shape that German conspiracy theories took. And this is my way of moving into the specific question about Germany and the alliances there, in that hardly any conspiracy theory about corona that is now popular in Germany is entirely new. It's rather these were longer, older narratives, and the pandemic is now something like the latest chapter, the latest strategy by the conspirators to achieve their goals. And this has in a way enabled the formation of a very strange alliance on German streets, because you have people from rather left-wing alternative esoteric milieus, people from right-wing extremist milieus, other people, because they all believed in different conspiracy theories before, and now they all believe in corona conspiracy theories, or corona is the latest chapter in their conspiracy theories. They very often cannot agree who's really behind all of that, but what they can agree on is that it's all a big hoax and not that the pandemic isn't really real. And this is something that is knitting their protest together at the moment. This is, however, not entirely new. We had this already in 2014-15 with the Vigils for Peace that protested against against how the West, in their eyes, was handling the situation in Ukraine and the Crimea at that point. So we're kind of seeing a repetition of that. What is worrying about what's happening at the moment is that many people who are rather from the left, who believe in these COVID conspiracy theories, have come to the conclusion that they're now living in a dictatorship and that it's 1933 again, and that Nazism is back with a different face. And this is, of course, something that is now met by a strategy from what's called the New Right in Germany. And the New Right differs from the Old Right in that it no longer positively refers to the Nazi regime. So it claims that the Nazi regime as National Socialism was a left-wing movement and and not really truly right-wing, and it tries to place the government of the Federal Republic of Germany in that tradition. So you have people from the left arguing the Nazis are back, you have people from the right arguing the Nazis are back, and what you see is a very weird alliance that was aptly described by German security forces as a new form of extremism. And I think that's perfectly right. And Marc-André made a very good point about how dangerous conspiracy theories can be in that they can lead to radicalization. And this alliance in many ways is an attack on German democracy. I would, however, still hold that as dangerous as it is when it comes to committing acts of violence, it is not yet a real threat to German democracy because it is too small. So this big demonstration where some people try to get into the Reichstag, that was about 20,000 people. So that's worrying, but it is not something that German democracy can't take, especially since there are no politicians around in Germany, except from the Alternative for Germany, who are really embracing and endorsing these beliefs. So this is something one needs to take seriously and that one needs to closely watch. But the thing that would have really worried me has not happened yet. And that is if we had seen the emergence of a truly populist movement where conspiracy believers link forces with people who don't necessarily believe in conspiracy theories, but who are also disaffected with the government, and how the government has handled the pandemic in recent months would have given people ample reason to form such an alliance. It hasn't happened yet, and that would have been really worrisome. So far, we need to take what's happening on the street seriously, but there's no need to panic yet.
I'll take the question
Okay.
from Anna about distinguishing the different type of QAnon followers versus others. I'm just going to share something I made for another presentation because it'll make explaining things a bit easier. When you talk about QAnon, one of the challenges is that it's not this amorphous whole. I know we talk about the QAnon movement, but it's really, Travis Yu says it very well. It's a big tent conspiracy. It concludes a lot of stuff. And it's not only conspiracy theories, but it brings in multiple groups together. And the pathway for radicalization or belief into this can lead to multiple places, whether it's, the movement I called pastel QAnon, that are more in this orange and yellow section, going into protesting about saving the children and protecting them from the rapists and the child molesters and the deep state government. You do have a category here that really falls into the anti-government sentiment. In the US, there's examples of how QAnon has blended in with, the 3%er movement. Benjamin Hung was an individual who was arrested after he drove his truck into a bunch of individuals protesting police injustice or abuse by police officers. There was another individual who believed in QAnon and saved the children who was arrested for trying to kidnap the governor of Michigan. What happens is, the way I distinguish this is basically what you have in the middle here is the QAnon at its core really breaks down to there's a globally active deep state cabal of satanic pedophile elites that are responsible for all the evil in the world. If an individual adheres and links to that core belief system, this is where I will put them in a type of category that is, okay, they're in the ballpark of QAnon belief. If you add on to that, sharing Q drops, interacting the content, it's not only consuming QAnon content, but it's also being a content creator and saying that you're making your own interpretations, you're pushing it. This is what will put someone into the QAnon pool. Obviously, this has evolved as we've gone to other platforms, as we've gone to over time, especially with the deplatforming, where there's, neo QAnon influencers. These are the people I'm thinking of, like Sidney Powell and Lynn Wood, who are individuals who are in a position of power. not only because they're lawyers, but they're also lawyers that were close to the Trump administration. It gives them a type of influence to inspire these individuals because of their proximity to the individual at the center of the conspiracy. But then you've also seen QAnon blend in with, neo-Nazism, militia movements, the sovereign citizen movement. Accelerationists are actively trying to recruit QAnon believers. And now it's going to be getting a little more difficult in the sense that you're not going to have this big box QAnon that you can even rely on. The movement's already balkanizing. You're going to see them blend in with others. It's really how an individual's adherence and belief and motivation to achieve QAnon's goal may lead them to fall into more or less extreme movements. Some of them might just say, that's it, I'm done, it didn't come true, I'll move on to something else. Going to be another conspiracy or some populist movement, they're going to find something else. Others might be, I'm fully committed, it wasn't enough for the information war, I'm going to take things into my old hands. There's no political solution. Here are groups that offer me options that are not political solutions. This is where the concern is, and this is coming out in a report I've been working on with ICSR. It's really about how these groups are further blending in together, and because of how they were deplatformed, it really is leading to a potential increase in threat actors, not because extreme violent extremists are better at recruiting. It's just, for the sake of argument, let's say the success rate for recruitment is 1%. And these chats had, there were 1,000 new members that were coming in per month. That's 10 people per month. After January 6th, you had a couple of million people that joined in these echo chambers. So your 1% success rate jumps to 100,000. 100,000. So 10,000, sorry. So your numbers really go up. If you're doing that over time, this is what it is. You're giving these individuals more people. And because you've deplatformed the extremists, those who use the extremists as a constituency or an audience are also going to move to these platforms. So you're going to bring in radicals into these spaces. So the long-term effect of radicalization pipelines are what's concerning. And this is how we're not going to be able to distinguish between QAnon, conspiracy theorists, and extremists. These labels are not necessarily going to be as useful as they were. And it's going to have to try to rethink how to deal with an amorphous whole that blends these multiple ideologies. And this is where we're going to get into a very difficult space, not only for academics, but those who kind of work in an analyst space working on these topics.
All right, thank you. I still wanted to do a last round of questions, but we don't have very much time. So I'm going to group some of these into 3 kind of main themes, and then again, take 5 minutes to answer whatever you'd like. The first set of questions. There's a first set of questions about the kind of what the content of these conspiracy theories. So one from David about the assumption seems to be that the adherents really believe in these crazy theories under Q or otherwise. Is this correct? Isn't there a substantial ludic aspect? People promoting Q theories as a sort of game, perhaps associated with supporting Trump or whatever. So, kind of the core, what's the core belief there? And linked to this, I think we can link this to Daniel's question. Is there a way to determine whether those using platforms to spread conspiracy theories are believers as opposed to those who are opportunists, basically exploiting the beliefs of others for various purposes? So that's one set of questions about the content of the belief. The second is the kind of who people doing this. So I'll take Nadia's question, which is what roles do the QTubers and influencers play in different QAnon scenes? For example, are they focused on local issues or do they cross over to other QAnon groups? For example, Quebec influencers on France or France influencers. And linked to this, I also had Rochelle's question. Rochelle Goldstein, are there growing trends of QAnon adherents crossing the spectrum of class and educational backgrounds? How has the economic uncertainty manifested and the extreme disparities of wealth correlated with conspiracy theories in general? And then one final, just to end, I think I do want to take some of the questions. Sorry if I couldn't read your question. We had really fascinating ones, but hopefully we'll have more occasions to speak about the future of these movements, right? So Britta Knauer asks, how do you see QAnon developing in the future differently from other conspiracies and why? And Emma Rosenblatt's questions. Conspiracy theories were minority groups when they were on mainstream platforms, although they were still able to spread a lot. They could still be monitored. Now on the underground, less popular platforms, we have a higher concentration of conspiracy theory groups and people. Does this increase the threat of radicalization? Could kicking them off these mainstream platforms turn out to have an adverse effect? So the kind of, who they are, what they're doing, and the future. If you had any reflections on any of these themes in 5 minutes, that would be great. 5 minutes each. Thank you.
Oh boy.
Go ahead, Marc-André. Most of this is QAnon. That's right down your alley.
I feel like I'm being sacrificed. Okay, so Nadia's question for QTubers. I think the growing transnational dimension of QAnon really shows how this does have an influence around the world. I'm going to take just the example of Amazing Polly and Wayfair, the conspiracy that started in the US about, Wayfair selling $20,000 cabinets because little girls were being sold in those cabinets. Started by a Canadian individual, didn't really go viral up until it went on to Reddit and someone else posted it, and then it came back online. What we saw was that once individuals started posting about this, Amazing Polly's video in English was then translated into French by Radio Quebec. So our lovely QAnon Quebec, I'm sorry that we're, as the French-speaking part of Quebec or of Canada, we're exporting stuff to Europe. It ended up in France and Belgium and Switzerland. This same French video was then translated into Spanish and Italian and Swedish and Hungarian and German and Dutch, and the gift of Canada went all across Europe. You're really seeing that it's not very hard for individuals online to translate content. Out of Shadows was translated into 20 different languages. It's in Chinese, in Israeli, in Hebrew, in Portuguese, Mandarin. Like, it's, you want to watch it in your native language, you can. It's really showing how these individuals are playing. Now, QTubers, I don't think is what we need to talk to. And I guess this could fit with the other platforms. Is it's no longer about YouTube because YouTube has just purged everything, but it's about Rumble, DLive, Twitch, World Truth Video, Cloud Hub. Like, the graph I had with maybe 20 platforms is the tip of the iceberg. My daily quick scan of QAnon and conspiracy theorists and extremists right now is up to 46 different platforms. The alt tech space has taken a huge role in taking all these individuals. A lot of these platforms are going to be very niche, very unique. And it creates a challenge not only for researchers, but for analysts who have to look at these spaces to do threat assessments. And you don't have the type of APIs that make data easily available. A lot of it relies on, OSINT. It's going to be manual research, qualitative assessment. It takes man hours to look at this content and make assessments. So the work to get actual proper assessment is even more difficult. So as Michael and I said, we don't know how many believers they are. We don't know, what their belief levels are. It's going to be even more difficult when you're on these platforms. So there is a consequence to deplatforming these people. Was it inevitable? After the actions of January 6th, it's kind of to be expected. Public outcry, political pressure are going to force these individuals off. The long-term effects, though, is because this is not, it's not Adam Waffen that you're prescribing and removing your problem. These were violent extremists, and general individuals that all got pulled in. The impact, we don't know what it's going to be. But once Michael gets his funding, I'm sure he's going to have plenty of research to do about this over the next few years, because it's going to take years to get where it's going. And this is where, I guess, I'll throw in Britta's question in here too, for in the future. It's going to evolve. It's going to change. And there's going to be a legacy to QAnon. There's going to be a legacy to COVID conspiracy theories. It has built community of believers around these ideas and this anti-establishment, anti-mainstream media perspective. And what's happened is all of these individuals have entered data voids. And at least in a digital ecosystem perspective, once you've entered these places, the algorithmic biases, the cultural biases, and the communities that you've built will keep you in these spaces long-term. So you don't know where this is going to, it could just lead them in the misinformation conspiracy circle. It could lead individuals down more extremist paths. What happens, though, is that they've entered these spaces and it's going to be very difficult to extricate them. So we need to consider creative solutions on how to deal with this. But it also means now that platforms need to consider, when they're going to remove people from their platforms, what is the potential impact? Am I going to potentially radicalize someone who is harmful into a violent extremist? Am I going to lead, people in MLM schemes down pathways that are going to be more extreme. How are you going to deal with hate speech if an individual who does hateful content might end down more radical path if you lead them offline? There's a lot that we need to think and reflect on. It changes the existing body of research. It exists, and it changes the existing threat matrices that we have made on these spaces. So yay for Michael and I. We have plenty of work cut out for ourselves, but also boo for Michael and I, because we have a lot of work ahead of ourselves. And I think that's something you need to keep in mind, is that we need to reevaluate how we consider these spaces prior to the pandemic and prior to the January 6th to what we're living through right now.
If we still have 2 minutes, I could say something about the Ludig aspect and the class and education question. So during the summer of 2019, I talked once or twice to an American graduate student who wanted to do his MA thesis on QAnon and gamification. And that made a lot of sense back then, because for a long while, QAnon was, I think, a particularly Ludig conspiracy theory, because it was different from other conspiracy theories. Usually conspiracy theories are about the conspiracy theorists figuring out what is really going on, identifying the evil agents and alerting the public to them so that something is done. With Q, it was different, because there it was about figuring out how Trump and his allies are fighting the conspiracy. So in a way, you could lean back and you could enjoy the clues and play around with that. Of course, then during late 2019, and then particularly with the pandemic, this changed, and QAnon conspiracy theories became more traditional in a certain sense, more alarmist. But I would suspect that some people who were drawn to them in the first place because of these Ludig aspects might still be around because of these aspects, or they may have left, or maybe they have become really concerned about what is going on. So once again, as Marc-André said, it's impossible to determine this without actually talking to these people. And the problem is very often they don't want to talk to researchers. Either they don't want to talk to you or they never stop talking. And then you can't really use anything either. Secondly, and very quickly, we know from a number of studies that belief in conspiracy theories is linked to education. So generally speaking, the higher your level of education is, the less likely you are to believe in conspiracy theories, not necessarily because you are smarter than other people, but because you are less likely to feel powerless and out of control. And these are things that drive belief in conspiracy theories. And when it comes to class and income, German polls, at least, don't really find a lot of a difference, but I think how people feel about their position in society is important. So one of the earliest quantitative studies done on conspiracy theories during the 1990s were in the US by a scholar named Ted Goertzel. And he usually found that African Americans tend to believe more in conspiracy theories than white Americans. And that made a lot of sense, because they feel more disenfranchised, they feel more insecure, and so on and so on. By now, these differences have all but gone, which also tells you something about how American society, I think, has developed. So there is a connection to class and education, and it's complicated. But what we should never forget is that even though conspiracy theories are often completely wrong, outlandish claims, they are also just as often, as Mark Fenster once said, onto something, in that they are distorted responses to real anxieties and issues. And this is something that sometimes gets lost in these discussions, the justified discussions about the concerns that we have, that they can also alert us to real social grievances. And this is something that might be worth reintroducing to future discussions of the topic.
Thank you so much to both. This was a really fascinating conversation, and I hope the audience enjoyed it as much as I did. I think, unfortunately, we have to close this event and come to an end. But again, the recordings are available online if you want to watch the previous sessions. And I hope it sounds like at least you both have a lot of work to do coming up. So we hope we can talk to you again at some point in the future. Thank you so much to everyone.